Whitehead's thought. So if this is the framework of metaphysics we're dealing with, let's try to relate it then to a broader history of process philosophy. Because again, Whitehead, it doesn't emerge from nowhere. Nobody emerges from nowhere. He's a part of a tradition that has processual antecedents, if you want. There's a stream of process style thinking that has very ancient roots. Okay, some of you have already mentioned some of these roots being a part of your interest. So one of the central pivots, right, an ideological pivot, if you want, around which process philosophy revolves can be stated broadly. Okay, namely that the nature of existence is best conceived in terms of creative process or flow, okay, rather than fixed substance. We're going to define that term shortly. In terms of verbs rather than nouns, okay, occurrences over things. A movie, moving stories, living stories rather than frozen pictures. And interconnection, interdependence rather than independence and isolation. So what we see here already is a type of dichotomy emerging between how we view the fundamental nature of things. There's a relationship between them, but this dichotomy is going to be important to make and it's important for the history of philosophy, for the history of metaphysics. We'll see some of that coming out more clearly. Now, some of you mentioned your interests in Eastern thought. Okay, and it's important to mention here that if we're thinking about historical antecedents of process style thinking, that long before some of the typical names we know, there are ancient Chinese antecedents. Okay, we have the pseudo type of mythical figure of Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao. We have, of course, Confucius, who is the author of the Analects. And process thinkers have long pointed to the fact that ancient Chinese traditions have had an implicit critique of this notion that what is fundamental is something that is unchanging, inert, or just static in some sense. Okay, so it's important to recognize this. So as Ames and Rhodsman have put it, early Chinese thinkers never seem to have perceived any substances that remain the same through time. Rather, they saw things relationally and related differently at different periods of time. Okay, Tao, conceived as the totality of things, is a process that requires the language of both change and persistence to capture its dynamic disposition. Okay, again, we see change, we see persistence, we see this element of dichotomy emerging. I love this artwork here, this flowing, moving ocean that is crashing, right? The water becomes this very important metaphor, if you want, for thinking processually. Okay, let's move then from China to India. Hey, many of you will know Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha, has a very important place among process thinkers. Okay, certainly in Claremont for many years and elsewhere, John Cobb was engaged in interreligious dialogue, interphilosophical dialogue, if you want, with Buddhist thinkers, because Buddhism is an ancient tradition which holds to fundamental notions that are really important for thinking processually. Okay, and here's just a couple examples. Okay, for the Buddha, some of you will know this. Existence is characterized by anicca. Okay, which essentially means the impermanence of all that is. Okay, the transient, evanescent, the constancy of change, the fact that things are arising and things are perishing, and this seems to be so fundamental for our experience. Okay, similarly, the Buddhist doctrine of pratitya samuppada, right? Say that 10 times fast. It's a essential doctrine for Buddhist thought, and it can be translated as dependent origination, or as one professor of mine called it, interdependent co-origination. I sort of like that notion better. And what it's affirming is this fundamental affirmation of relationality, of interconnection in the arising and the perishing of things. And process thought thinkers have also pointed to Zen Buddhist doctrine of sunyata, right? The notion that emptiness or no thingness is what characterizes reality, right? This is a notion that's resonated with process thinkers. Not that there's absolutely nothing there, but that it's not so clear that they're things in any sort of a noun sense, in any inert sense, okay? So Buddhism has held a very, very fundamental place. So again, it's really important for us to see that both early Chinese and Indian thought, these are antecedents to process style thinking. Now, it is the case that process thought emerged in the West. It is a Western phenomenon in terms of an established school of thought. Okay, Whitehead was a man of the East, but it's certainly not limited to that. And it's important to say that because Whitehead himself recognized this rather clearly. Okay, consider his statement to this effect. He says, process philosophy, or my philosophy, seems to approximate more to some strands of Indian or Chinese thought than to Western, Asiatic, or European thought. One side makes process ultimate, the other side makes fact ultimate. Okay, so he's noticing this dimension of resonance anyway. And it's important for us as we are students in process thought to see that we're not just purely dealing with an established Western school, but we're dealing with notions that go all the way back in recorded human history in some sense to ancient Chinese, Indian thought. And notice also he's making this dichotomy again. One side makes process ultimate, one side makes fact ultimate. Now, ultimately, we have to make sense of both process and fact, of permanence and change. But process style thinkers are going to lean towards one being more primary than the other, okay? And we're gonna get to that here in just a bit. Okay, if we've moved from China to India, let's move then from India to Greece. Okay, some of you will know the name of Heraclitus in the 6th century, who says there is nothing permanent but change. And notice again the irony of saying change is permanent, right? This sort of struggle between permanence and change. Okay, so in the Western world, pre-Socratic Greek thinker, Heraclitus is often said to be the founding father of process philosophy. Okay, and this is at least comes forth in our Nicholas Rescher book. Okay, in famously saying all things flow, okay, Panto Re, some of you will have heard this, he pictures reality to be moving like this kindling sort of flame, right? And you see also this almost antithesis between the contrast of fire, the movement of water, and yet what they have in common is this endless movement, right? You cannot step in the same river twice. There's the statement I hope some of you heard. It's often cited with reference to Heraclitus. Now, Whitehead found Heraclitus to be very important, particularly in contrast to ancient philosophers of permanence. Okay, Parmenides, for example, the great antagonist of Heraclitus, at least that's often how it's presented, he praised permanence. Okay, he said change is ultimately an illusion, right? It's mere appearance. It's not fundamental when we look at the world from the widest possible perspective. Okay, other key philosophers of the pre-Socratic world, that's pre-Socrates, Lysippus, okay, Democritus, Epicurus, okay, some of these names you may have heard of. Okay, collectively they're known as the atomists. Okay, and what that means is they essentially saw that nature is composed of these unchanging, these inert material atoms, okay, what we might call substances. They move about in space, they bump one into another, there's sort of external movement, but in their own internal constitution, there is no change. Okay, so these philosophers of permanence, that Heraclitus, that process thinkers are in a deep sense going to be at odds with. Okay, so we mentioned already that a certain thematic dichotomy emerges in the history of metaphysics. It's important to see that. And the question is raised about priority. So let's look in a certain comparative way at some of the differences. So substance philosophy, and substance is a term that's used all throughout philosophy, and versus process philosophy. Okay, and they're sort of the disgruntled cousins of each other, you might say in a certain way. So one is going to emphasize reality in terms of things, right? Noun entities. The other in terms of happenings, occasions, verb entities, movement. Okay, one would say discrete individuality. The other active relations. One would say separateness, independence versus relationality and interdependence. Okay, fixity and stability versus innovation and novelty. Merely surface level change, right? These atoms move, they bump into each other, but they don't change internally, right? Surface level change versus ontological change. That is change being at the fundamental core of existing. One might focus on eternity, the unchanging eternal, while the other focuses on temporal, right? We'll see that Whitehead does something very beautiful with eternity and temporality. Okay, another way, passivity and indifference versus activity and participation. And if we're thinking of ways to think about this, reality as a stone, a pyramid, statue are made up of these things, versus process thinking, more of a stream, okay, a river, rain. It's falling, it's flowing, it's active. One might be summarized with the language of being, and the other summarized with the language of becoming. Okay, we see that there's going to be a relationship here, but that process thinkers on the whole are going to side with these dimensions on the right. Okay, that we have to make sense of the fact that we have discrete things in the world that seem to persist. They don't seem to change. I mean, think of a rock, for goodness sake. It doesn't seem to change immediately. It's something incredibly solid and seemingly permanent, millions of years. That's true. But when you come to fundamental priorities, process thinkers, and certainly Whitehead, are going to affirm the right side of this list. Okay, and this is something that comes out in Rescher's statement, right? That becoming and change, origination, flourishing, the passing of the old, the innovative emergence of ever new existence, these constitute some of the central themes of process metaphysics.